It was 5 o'clock on a winter's morning in Syria, and Detective Hercule Poirot was bound for Istanbul. As my second Agatha Christie, I read Murder on the Orient Express, which was my first introduction to Detective Poirot, because he doesn't make an appearance in And Then There Were None, which is the first book I read of this author. Poirot, the brilliant Belgian detective, is called to London and gets on the Orient Express in Istanbul. Before long, a murder happens, and since the train has been halted due to the heavy snowfall, the murderer must still be on board. And unfortunately for the murderer, there's a detective on board as well. The plot of this book is so intricate and well thought out. Every word the author uses serves the plot, and everything is so brilliantly tied together at the end. There's no flowery prose, but there are sharp dialogues, red herrings, and stable pacing, which makes Agatha Christie's style, and I personally really enjoy it. While the book is clever, it's very accessible and doesn't feel like a difficult read. I loved following along in Poirot's analysis and thought process as he figures out who the culprit is. I love mysteries, but have watched too many crime shows and mysteries, and because of that I'm often a bit disappointed when the solution is just too obvious too early on. But that's not the case with Agatha Christie's mysteries, because there's no way of figuring them out unless you are Sherlock Holmes yourself. When presented with all the evidence, his colleague says that it's impossible to solve, and the detective himself says, "The impossible could not have happened, therefore the impossible must be possible in spite of appearances." Aside from the writing and the plot, there is a nice added layer of themes that I really enjoyed. The question of justice versus morality, identity and prejudices. I won't go into detail about these because it would spoil some key aspects of the plot, but just to say that it's not just a mystery. Agatha Christie's novels age well and are generally beloved, but of course no book is without its critiques, two of which I wanted to address in particular, those related to the characters. A common one is the issue of stereotypical portrayals of the characters, which are tied to race and class. The stereotypes in this book are definitely dated, but all the characters are stereotyped to the same level regardless of their background, and each character is analyzed in relation to this, which made me not as bothered by it. Another critique on the characters is that they lack deep character development, which is true to some extent, but I think for this type of mystery you need characters to stay sufficiently mysterious, and the time span of the period of the book is very limited. So to me the characters were sufficiently memorable, and it makes sense that they are pieces to a puzzle in a whodunit novel. This book is great if you enjoy locked room puzzles and clever mysteries that are difficult to figure out. Even though this is not the first book in the Poirot series, you can definitely read this one as a standalone as well. I also loved And Then There Were None before, which is also a locked room puzzle, yet an entirely different story and vibe, so I would recommend that one also. I think I might actually like that one even more because it has the thriller element to it. I bought both of my Agatha Christie books secondhand and have passed them on, both of them, to a new owner, because I think these are books that anyone from any age and with any reading preferences would enjoy. But I am keeping an eye on finding some pretty copies because these are the type of books that I would love in my home library. But for now, I'm keeping these stories on my shelf through my reading journal. As it so happens, I went to Istanbul last month for the first time, and of course I had to visit the train station where the Orient Express leaves, or left because sadly this line doesn't run anymore. I would love to see Istanbul connected again with Western Europe because I did fall in love with the city in the short of 48 hours that I spent there, and I can't wait to go back. For my reading journal spread, I used light brown paper, old book paper, a fine liner, and some colored pencils. Of course, the train station is the focus of my journal spread, and it's such a beautiful building, and the stained glass details are so pretty, so I wanted to recreate a piece of it in my journal. On the left side, I first tore up some brown paper and old book paper, leaving a gap in the middle, and then I made a drawing of the train station door in fine liner on the 3 different backgrounds. On the right side, I layered the same type of papers and wrote my review on top. I went for some classic serif fonts for the title and book review, and then a handwritten style one for the author's name. I tried to also create some burnt edges for all of the layered papers as well, to give it that additional detail and tie into the story. Bunny opens with, "We call them bunnies because that is what they call each other." Seriously, Bunny. The first few chapters read as a regular dark academia young adult book, which is deceiving because what comes next is anything but regular. Bunny definitely has dark academia characteristics to it. It's set in a prestigious school, focuses on a mysterious clique who performs these arcane rituals. There's a social commentary and, of course, murder. But Bunny definitely transcends the dark academia genre. It's got horror, magical realism, maybe fantasy, maybe thriller. I'm not sure if I've ever read a book as disorienting as Bunny, and that's why I won't discuss any other plot points, because it wouldn't make sense anyways. I do, however, want to talk about some of the themes and symbolism in this book. I'm not sure if these things would be considered spoilers. I don't think so, but if you want to go into Bunny blind, as I would suggest you do, I would skip to the next timestamp where I'll talk about my journal spread before heading into the next book. The first theme is identity and belonging. Samantha, our main character, hates the bunnies but also kind of wants to be a bunny, and is caught between wanting to belong to this group and who she claims to want to be as an individual, which is someone who makes fun of the bunnies together with her best friend Ava. The bunnies themselves symbolize groupthink and how in creative environments people tend to sacrifice their authenticity and individuality for acceptance by the community. You see this through the harsh criticism that the bunnies give to Samantha at the start, calling her work too dark, etc. And while this is an interesting and valuable message, I did go back and forth on the approach with the bunnies. At first I liked it. When the book starts showing its horror side, the bunnies are almost chimeric. They have this collective behavior and allure, but scariness at the same time. But then over time it felt more like just demonizing girly behavior, feminine habits, and doting friendships, which kind of put me off. But then I thought I could see it from a feminist perspective, in the sense that they are slut-shaming, there's this lack of agency. When there is desire for men, everything else goes out the window. But then that would still leave hyper-feminine women as those critiqued, unless I'm not really getting the point here, which is also entirely possible. Then there's a theme of madness in the surreal. If the bunnies are a reference to Alice in Wonderland, every bunny reader, whether you enjoy this book or not, finds himself going down a rabbit hole and arriving dazed and confused. The boundaries between reality and hallucination blur. There are bizarre rituals, potentially horror scenes, potentially fantasy scenes, where you're just not sure what is going on. And there's definitely a feeling of Samantha slipping more and more into madness. For me, this uncertainty of, is it magic, is it hallucination, were interesting. How do we come to a clear resolution of that by the end of the book? But I'm not sure what it was ultimately. Maybe it was both, maybe it was neither. But I am the type of reader who likes some closure. And then that's probably my biggest issue with this book, that I like my ends tied up neatly, and I didn't get that from Bunny, both for big plot elements, but neither for small things. Now I heard that there will be a sequel that will also be a prequel, and maybe that'll explain things, but I'm not sure. I'll find out. It does leave me wondering what gave the wide appeal of Bunny, because I didn't find it an accessible read. I had to rely on book reviews by others to really figure out what was legitimate criticism from my side and what parts I just didn't get. Did I enjoy Bunny? I'm not sure. I enjoyed the first part and then it somewhat lost me, but I do think it's a valuable read in the sense that it makes some good points. If you haven't read Bunny, I would read it if you like the unhinged woman vibe mixed with dark academia. Don't read it if you came for the gory horror or if you were hoping for proper cult vibes, nor if you need closure in a book or a solid magic system explained. For my reading journal, I used one sheet of dark red and black paper, some old book pages, a fine liner, and a red pencil. On the left, I have a dark red background, and then I cut out a black frame shape to layer on top, and then finished with an old book paper where I wrote Bunny in a minimalist, whimsical type font, and then drew some equally whimsical bunny doodles and gave them little red hearts. For the right side, I tore up some pieces of the different papers with the leftovers and assembled them around the outside of the page to form a messy scrap paper frame, and then wrote my review in the middle. In my search for understanding Bunny, I read a review on Goodreads where someone called it a feminist fight club, which didn't help me because I hadn't read nor seen Fight Club, but I was intrigued both to what that meant and what that implied for Fight Club as a book, so of course that's what I had to read next. The first rule about Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. Everyone knows this iconic line, myself included, but I had never had the urge to watch or read Fight Club. But I was desperate to make some sense of Bunny, so I paid 90 cents at the secondhand bookshop, thinking I would probably not enjoy this book very much, but 90 cents was acceptable and well spent if it would help me bring some clarity on Bunny. But as I was reading Fight Club, I didn't actually think about Bunny at all because the voice in writing is so different. But when I looked back at the end, it actually did make some sense. But before I get into that, let's talk a little bit about Fight Club in case some of you have also not read or watched this story before. The story is told from an unnamed narrator's perspective. He's an office worker suffering from really bad insomnia and who feels unfulfilled in his job and just in life. His only way of relief to get him some peace of mind and sleep, for some reason, is attending support groups for illnesses he doesn't actually have. But then he meets Tyler. And the book opens with, Tyler gets me a job as a waiter. After that, Tyler's pushing a gun in my mouth and saying, the first step to eternal life is you have to die. Tyler is charismatic, he knows what he wants, and what he wants is to fight the system by destroying it. So he tells our main character, this is your life and it's ending 1 minute at a time. Together they form Fight Club, an underground movement where men come to release their frustrations through brutal bare-knuckle fights. Fight Club is an unapologetic critique of society, with a focus on consumer culture, how people define themselves by what they own, but also societal expectations and the loss of traditional masculinity. Our narrator feels stripped of his purpose in life, and he's just consumed by his meaningless corporate job and materialistic desires, and Fight Club is how he reclaims his sense of self. One of the reasons why I never thought to read Fight Club is because I have little interest in reading about physical violence. And while there is definitely a good amount of graphic violence, the violence in the story is symbolic. Violence represents rebellion against consumer culture and social norms and the emotional numbness that people experience. The book also shows this response to a flawed a flawed society as problematic, the path of destruction escalates, and the fights and acts of anarchy offer only temporary release. They don't actually provide real meaning to their life or change the world. There's also a large mental illness, identity crisis theme, of which I won't say much in case you haven't read or watched Fight Club, and I wish you to discover that part when you do. I would recommend this book if you enjoy thought-provoking books on themes of consumerism, masculinity, rebellion. Also, if you like unreliable narrators and a minimalist writing style that is kind of unconventional due to this fragmented kind of stream of consciousness writing. On the other hand, if you do not want to read about physical and psychological violence, because it does get quite explicit, I would give this one a miss. But to come back to the comparison with Bunny, as I mentioned at the start, some have called Bunny a feminist Fight Club, and while they're all vastly different in their setting and writing style, they do have some shared core themes. There is the identity crisis and psychological breakdown. In both books, the main character struggles with their sense of self and loneliness and how it can affect how they perceive the world around them. There's a definite critique of societal expectations in both, Fight Club focusing on masculinity and capitalism, whereas Bunny focuses on toxic femininity and female relationships. Beyond themes, we can also see recurring things like secret, cult-like groups, violence, transformation, unreliable narrator, psychological horror even maybe. There's actually so much you could discuss on this, so if you have read one or the other, I would suggest looking into this comparison, which I found quite interesting. And while I would have guessed that I would prefer the feminist option, my preference does actually go out to Fight Club. I think the writing style is more my thing. There is resolution and clarity on the message without it being spelled out. Quotability, I love a good quote, and reread value as well. Coming to the end of the book, understanding things now, I do want to read it again to study it a bit more. For the journal spread, I used craft paper, sheets from 3 different notebooks, some pieces of scraps that I found in a magazine, blue paint, and a regular blue ballpoint pen. I started by painting the title Fight Club on a checkered notebook paper. I use a thick brush because I wanted it to have a very casual look of perhaps inconspicuous advertising for Fight Club. I also wrote out the rules of Fight Club on a small notebook page and my review on the 3rd notebook paper, which I tore loosely, making sure to keep this side with the rings for some extra texture. And then I layered them all, paying attention to create contrast of colors where I could. When I set up my reading journal for 2025, I mentioned that one of my reading projects would be to learn more about storytelling. And I started by reading The Anatomy of Story by John Truby. I picked this one because it seems to be a staple read on storytelling, making it on many lists of must-reads when it comes to this topic, and is pretty highly rated. And I'm glad that I picked this to be the first book to read because it gave me a great foundation for my next reads. So let's start with what I liked about the book. It's a detailed guidebook on telling a story. It's very clear in description and has actual concrete steps and exercises as well as examples from popular stories. This really helped me to understand the theory that was explained so much better, and I found it really, really practical to learn from. But there are also 2 things in particular that really bothered me. The author does insist that the formula which he presents of writing a story is the only one. And perhaps it's because this book was written in 2007 and storytelling has evolved a lot in the past 20 years and people have shown that you can tell stories in many different ways. I just don't think it's necessarily true that there's only one formula of writing a good story. As a beginner storyteller, this book was still very useful because I'm starting from little to no knowledge on the storytelling craft. Another point that I really disliked was that early on in the book, the author writes, "I'm going to assume that the main character is male simply because it's easier for me to write that way." And then that is exactly what he does for the rest of the book, and I would love for that to change if this book ever gets a new edition. I do think that the author could take some time to not only adjust, but also definitely not explicitly write that anyone who doesn't identify as male is inconveniencing his job of writing this book, and that somehow makes that okay. And then he also talks about, for example, the movie African Queen and only mentions the male actor and not Katharine Hepburn, who also very much is a main character. So there's definitely that issue with this book as well. But despite this, I do conclude that it was a very useful read for me. I learned a lot. It gave me a lot of new avenues for research as well, and I would definitely recommend it if you are a beginner to the subject. But I would also say don't stop there. I don't think this is the only book you should read on storytelling, but rather see it as a first introduction to the subject. As for most of my fiction reads, I kept the spread very simple with the different chapters of the book. It gives me at a glance the main parts of the book, which I find really useful for returning or referring back to them later. I used 3 colors of gel pens to write the title of the book in an elegant font and then make some floral ornaments around the sides of the page and created a frame. In Intermezzo, we follow 2 brothers, Peter and Ivan. Peter is a 32-year-old lawyer and Ivan is a 22-year-old chess prodigy. They've just lost their father and both of them are coping with this grief in different ways. Already complex family dynamics are worsened in this period of loss, remembrance, anger, and regret. While all of Sally Rooney's books are decidedly different, they have this one thing in common, which is the exploration of human connection. Intermezzo does focus on Peter and Ivan's relationship, their wider family, and also their romantic relationships. We alternate perspectives between the 2 brothers, during which, in Sally Rooney style, we get a deep understanding of their thoughts, feelings, and reasoning. The characters, both the main characters and some of the side characters as well, are incredibly introspective. We get almost an analysis of their internal conflicts, which works really well with Sally Rooney's writing style. It's minimalistic, but there's a lot of emotional weight behind the choice in words. Despite the level of detail that we get into the emotional inner workings of the characters, I do love how Sally Rooney sees her audience as intelligent. She doesn't feel the need to spell everything out, explain what is happening, but she trusts her audience. I always have a hard time reviewing this author's books because even though I feel melancholic and emotionally drained after reading her books, they are so incredibly memorable and brilliantly written. I think with this book in particular, I loved that she captures a lot of these in-between moments of life. And while my preference definitely goes to books or media which romanticize the mundane and have this wonderful small things in life, I think that Sally Rooney in some ways does the same, but just in a more melancholic, existential, vulnerable way by capturing moments which are deeply emotional, but not in a dramatic way. And I think she's done that throughout her books, but with Intermezzo, I've come to really appreciate that about her writing. Intermezzo will give you the signature post-Rooney blues, the feeling that this book gives you, it lingers. You can't put this book down and then never think about it again. It will just pop up in your brain when you least expect it. For the journal spread, I used 1 page of dark green paper, some craft paper, a brown envelope, a paper coaster, some watercolor paint, and a white gel pen. And then I also just used a piece of notebook and a regular ballpoint pen to write the review. I started by cutting the paper coaster in half to use on each side of the journal to create some symmetry. On the left side, I used the dark green paper for the background, while on the right side I used the craft paper, and then on top I layered it with the contrasting color. The brown envelope with the review inside went on top of the green page, and then on the right side I put a green piece of paper on which I painted some faint flowers in white watercolor paint on top of the brown craft paper. So these are my spreads for my recent reads from January and February. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you did. I'll be back soon with more reading journal updates. Thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day.